Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 26th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates and details, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the northern direction, about Chernihiv and Sumy area. According to information we have from the sources on the ground, mainly from the Ukrainian side, we see significant number of complaints that were sent from the Ukrainian soldiers in this area to the military authorities, to Ukrainian courts, to the relatives and friends, trying to asking them to help them to fix the situation. And what is the problem? According to information we have, the Ukrainian military authorities, Ukrainian commanders start redeployment of forces from Sumy and Chernihiv to Donetsk, Kupiansk direction. So from the peaceful area, let's call it like this, to the area of the most fierce and heavy clashes. And according to information we have, the forces in this area, this territory, is under protection of forces that weren't trained for active combats on the ground. So there are territory defense forces that can control the territory, and the only thing they can fight with is Russian reconnaissance and sabotage groups. Furthermore, according to information we have from other sources, let's say one of the battalion from this area that recently, according to the Ukrainian authorities, commanders, was redeployed to Donetsk or Kupiansk or Avdiivka direction, was completed for 70% of people with different disabilities. So 70% battalion consists of people of certain disabilities, and this battalion was redeployed in, let's say, Avdiivka, maybe in the area of Tsarskaya Khota. There are a few things that we need to note and understand. First of all, what is the reason why the Ukrainians took a decision to do this? The first answer is that Ukrainians try to save their very important and, let's say, forces of strategical brigades, mechanized forces, and well-trained forces of 47th Brigade, 110th Brigade, and many other different, let's say, experienced brigade, and they try to replace them with, let's call it like this, mid soldiers. And the second reason is that the Ukrainians still haven't managed to adopt the mobilization law, and now they are forced to use everything they have. So completely two different stories, which can lead to completely different consequences and, let's say, endings. Now we are moving to the situation on the ground, and first we're going to start with Kupiansk direction. We also got a lot of very interesting details and updates from this territory. First we're going to talk about Russian updates, updates about Russia. According to Ukrainian sources, recently the Russians have redeployed significant number of fresh reserves on Kupiansk direction. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians concentrated their forces, new fresh forces, in the vicinity of Svatovo, Sinkovki, Kremenoy, and Liman first. So obviously this can mean just one thing, that the Russians are planning to start their offensive operation, another wave of offensive operation during the next few days. And you need to understand one thing, and that the Russians don't have much time. This is the most important thing that we need to always to keep in our minds. The Russians currently have just 3 or 4 weeks of active clashes, 3 or 4 weeks that they can use to attack the Ukrainian positions on the ground, trying to cross fields, forests, attacking the villages from different directions. And after that, somewhere in the end of February, all this territory will be completely, you won't be able to use this area for anything. This is going to be just mud and water, and the equipment and tanks will stuck in this area, and everything will be stopped by the weather. So from 3 to 4 weeks. Of course, you might say that, of course, for 4 weeks the Russians are not able to, let's say, achieve anything. The Russians don't need to achieve anything during the next 3 or 4 weeks. The only things the Russians need is to enter the cities. So during the next 4 weeks, the Russians need to find the solution how to establish control over, let's say, first buildings of Kupiansk. If they can do this, then during the period of time of March, late February, March, and April, when there is no possibilities to move forces on the ground, you can stay in the cities and to fight for cities. So you will storm areas like the Wagners did in Bakhmut or something like this. So for these purposes, they have just 3 or 4 weeks. Furthermore, other Russian sources, for example, reported that Ukrainians have significant problems with supply and support on Avdiivka and Kupiansk direction. According to information we have, the Ukrainians have some gap in reserves up to 60% of necessary quantity. 60%, that there's a very big gap. The Ukrainians basically don't have reserves, according to some Russian sources. Of course, we can't say whether it's true or not. We can see this just on the ground, and the situation on the ground currently tell us that the Ukrainians don't have problems. But let's see what is going to be next. Maybe the Ukrainians currently are using their final reserves in the fight with Russia. Now we are moving further to Yagidno-Ivanovka direction. The previous few days, the Ukrainians conduct another offensive operation, counter-offensive operation, from Ivanovka in direction of Yagidno, with the purpose to return control over the 3 lines that located between 2 cities. But that attack was repelled by the Russians. First, the Russian reconnaissance team managed to discover the movements of Ukrainian tanks and personnel carriers, and after that the Russians start bombing and attacking this area. The Ukrainians lost our tank, as you can see. Also, the Ukrainians lost personnel carrier. The attack was repelled, and the Russians managed to save their positions along this 3 line. And this is a very interesting situation, because this is the 3 line we are talking about. When talking about November, October, and December of 2023, during 1 week, these 3 lines might be either under Russian and Ukrainian control, let's say 5 or 6 times. So in the first half of the week, the Ukrainians controlled this territory. The next half of the week, the Russians were controlling this territory. So it wasn't something like long-term positions. It was always temporary positions, either for the Russians or for the Ukrainians. But when talking about January, the Russians established control over this territory a few weeks ago, maybe a week ago or something like this. And since that time, the Ukrainians made few attempts to counterattack the Russians, but they still haven't managed to force the Russians to step back, which probably means that the Russians are planning not to give up, and they're planning to dig in deeper and to concentrate forces, and after concentration of forces, to try to attack Ivanovka from the western direction. This is a very important thing, because if the Russians are able to establish control over this village, of course, then we see that Ukrainians in Kislovka-Kotlerovka will appear in some certain half encirclement, because there are Russian positions on the south in Krakhmalna. Probably the Russians will establish control over Ivanovka. Obviously, after the battle of Ivanovka, the Russians will try to move further to the west, and during the next 3-4 weeks, the Russians might encircle the Ukrainians in Kislovka-Kotlerovka, and this is exactly what the Russians will try to do during the next 3-4 weeks. After that, they can stop, let's say, somewhere on this line, and during February and March, they can, let's say, start very slow storming of this stronghold with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to step back. So this is exactly they need for the next 3 or 4 weeks. The time is not enough for, let's say, getting the Oskol River or Zherebets River. Maybe Zherebets the Russians will be able to get. There were no updates from Krakhmalna. Just another Ukrainian tank was discovered by the Russian forces in the village by the name of Peshchane to the west of Krakhmalna, and as a result of strike with accurate shell Krasnopol, that tank was destroyed. Just the only thing from this direction. When talking about Liman area, we haven't received anything, and there were no movements spotted neither from the Russian nor from the Ukrainian side. But once again, the same rule works for this area as well. The Russians have just from 3 to 4 weeks to get the first villages, and as you can see, for the next 3 or 4 weeks, the Russians at least need to get this line. If they can bypass these territories, then they will be able to, let's say, during the March, April, and beginning of May, to complete the clearing of Liman direction and to establish control over every single village along Zherebets River, starting from Tarskoye, Terny, Novosadovo, Nevskaya. Once again, because they will enter the buildings, the village, the, let's say, normal ground under their feet or something like this, because it will be very unlikely the Russians can attack and to make these fields breakthroughs with armored vehicles during early March or late February, because it will be completely impossible to use this, let's say, area for broad frontline attacks through the fields. Now we are moving to Solidar Sivers direction. We have a lot of updates, as you can see, a lot of geolocated videos. The Russians intensified their activity on this area. During just the previous day, we got significant number of drones and Lancets and FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian positions in Siversk itself and in the villages around this area. So nothing special, just Lancet strikes, drone strikes, nothing more. The only thing that that we need to pay attention to is that I don't remember such a level of activity on this front line probably for the previous year. The last time the Russians were so active on this area were during the battle for Lysychansk and Severodonetsk agglomerations. And now we see the Russians renew their attacks, and they're very, as you can see, aggressive. They're attacking artillery, they're suppressing Ukrainian artillery forces, armored vehicle forces, tank forces. They try to suppress long-range artillery and to establish complete artillery superiority, which will allow the Russians, of course, to start the operation on the ground as well. And I'll remind you that just yesterday we got another report that as a result of some strike that took place in Siversk, in this area, the Russians managed to destroy the headquarters of 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, and the officers of that brigade died as a result of that strike. So we see that the Russians are pretty concentrated and pretty focused in this area. And that became possible because of the fact that the Russians established control over Veselaya, and they have some certain progress along the railways. So within the next few days, the same rule, 3-4 weeks, also works for this direction. During the next 3 or 4 weeks, the Russians need to get inside of the buildings, inside of the villages. It will allow them to move further along the streets, because it is much easier to move along the normal, like not like soft like ground, but normal like roads, buildings, and so on. Now we are moving probably to the most important direction for the previous 24 hours, to Bakhmut-Artyomovsk area. The Russians continue their offensive operation in Bogdanovka area. They published additional videos with FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces. As you can see, mainly all strikes took place in the central part of the village, which is another confirmation that by 26th of January, the Russians still haven't managed to bypass the central part of the village. Very interesting report we got from Russian military expert Vybor. If you remember, he colored this territory as the area under Russian control, but today in his daily report, or let's say not daily but frontline report, he told us that the Russians retreat from the central part, withdraw their positions to the northeastern, and he also adjusted his map in the central part. Anyway, there are still lots of job to do, and if we increase the numbers of updates, we see the Russian concentration. Obviously, it will not take, let's say, months or years to clear Bogdanovka. Obviously, soon the fortifications in this area will be reduced to ruins, and then the Russians will be able to continue movements. When talking about the 3-4 weeks rule, this rule doesn't work for this area because the Russians are already in the city. So the rule of like bad weather and bad conditions doesn't work for the clashes inside of the villages and cities. So the Russians will have possibilities regarding the weather, regarding any activity on other front lines, to continue movements in Bogdanovka. So when talking about like in front attack, like in front, not like trying to bypass or encircle this area from different directions. Now we are moving to Popovo Forest, New Cemetery. This area, the Russians are doing the same story. They're bombing and storming this territory without any operation on the ground. Today they published another video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian strongholds in the New Cemetery along the tree line between Bogdanovka and Popovo Forest. The Russians were bombing Popovo Forest itself. So as you can see, very heavy fire and very heavy pressure against the Ukrainian positions. If we increase the number of updates, we see that this area is under very heavy fire from the Russian side. And this is very important when talking in particular about this territory. The 3-4 weeks rule works for this area. But another important thing that we need to keep in your mind, that the Russians started bombing and reducing this territory till ruins probably 3 or 4 weeks ago. So of course it can't be endless process. You can't bomb Popovo Forest and New Cemetery, let's say, for the next 2-3 weeks. The Russians are about to finish this process, and very soon they will start the ground operation. And something tells me, we will discuss this in a minute, that within the next 1 or 2 or 3 days the Russians will launch, not like reconnaissance in combat or in force, they will launch a full-scale operation against the Ukrainian positions in the New Cemetery and in the vicinity, in the area of this defense belt between New Cemetery and Bogdanovka. And of course the Russians will try to attack New Popovo Forest. So So 2-3 days and the Russians will launch this attack. And you may ask, why do I think so? The thing is that the most important updates are coming from Ivanivske, from this area. If you remember, just yesterday we were talking about the satellite picture from this area. We were talking about this picture, and on this picture we can see some artillery focus against the tree line between Ivanivske and Topor or X defense stronghold to the south of Ivanivske or to the north of 215.7 hill. And we have made two conclusions that possibly there are two options. First one is that the Russians were moving along this tree line in direction of Ivanovska. So something like this, the Russians were moving and the Ukrainians were bombing them with artillery. And the second option is that while the Russians were storming this X and Topor fortification, this intersection of tree lines, the Ukrainians were counterattacking them along this road and the Russians were bombing them. So two options. I don't know whether they're like what kind of third option might be. First, during the day, we got the geolocated confirmation of complete Russian control over this tree line. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they were bombing with FPV drones the Russian forces in this area, which is complete confirmation that this territory will be colored in red color because of Russian complete control. Later, during the day, we got additional updates from some Russian sources that the Russians launched attacks between in direction of Ivanovska, between Klishchevka and Ivanovska, but without any clarifications. The Russians were attacking, but where exactly the Russians were attacking, it was very difficult to understand. And right before we start making this video, the military expert Rybor published his own report, that as a result of very fierce clashes, the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt along the tree line between, let's say, that's for the stronghold Topor or X and Ivanovska itself. The Russians managed to bypass this tree line and to capture the first buildings and streets inside of Ivanovska. So as we discussed, the Russians didn't have any possibilities to attack from Chernobyl. It's because this field was mined, and maybe currently is mined. So that's why the Russians took a decision to attack in direction of Ivanovska from the south. And they were moving first to capture this intersection of roads. After that, the Russians step by step started moving to the north along this area. And according to Rybor, without any geolocated confirmations, as a result of clashes, currently the Russians established control over this territory, and the Russians are trying to dig in deeper because the upcoming night and upcoming days are going to be very hot for the Russians, because the Ukrainians will counterattack with the purpose to restore control over this territory. And obviously the Russians need just to stay there as long as possible, because they need to establish safe roads, safe supply road from Chernobylets, from this residential area with Ivanovska, and then this is going to be the end of the village. During the previous few days, the Russians were bombing heavily Ivanovska, and we got the videos of those flamethrower strikes, because obviously either the Ukrainians and the Russians didn't expect that the Russians would be so successful, as I understand, and just to improve their positions and to enforce their, let's say, foothold, the Russians were bombing Ivanovska heavily, trying to, let's say, to break any attempt from the Ukrainian side to send reinforcements and reserves and so on. When talking about Ivanovska, we need to understand one thing, that Ivanovska is located in the lowland in comparison with the stronghold Domino, with the Avdiivka stronghold. I'm talking about this area. This is the area of high-rise building that the Russians can use, and they're using to control the complete entire situation over Ivanovska. The Russian can coordinate, can send FPV drones, can send, have communication equipment, electronic warfare equipment. The Russians see Ivanovska as if they're located exactly inside of the village. So the situation for the Ukrainians is very bad, and something tells me currently there are a lot of battles all over the line of combat contact: Avdiivka, Rabotina, Marinka, Georgievka, Novomikhailivka, Ivanovska, Bogdanovka, Sinkovka. A lots of clashes, a lots of battles, but something tells me that the Russians will bypass Ivanovska very easy and very fast. And the reason of that is that this village is located in the lowland, and the Russians can see everything from Artyomovsk. And this is the first reason. The second is that the Russians have already entered this territory. And this is the reason I'm telling you why the Russians are going to launch an attack in direction of Popovo Forest within the next 48 hours. They need to start support operation with the purpose to stretch the Ukrainian reserves and not to allow them to concentrate significant number of forces in Ivanivske. Of course, the Ukrainians have chances to repel attacks, and as they did in Sinkovka, the Russians also, if you remember, entered the edge position, the northern part of Sinkovka, but they were defeated and were forced to step back. The Russians entered Novomikhailivka in farms and in cemetery, but they were defeated there as well, and they were forced to step back and retreat. So everything is possible. The Ukrainians have chances to repel this attack as well, but something tells me that they won't be able to do this. Furthermore, I'll remind you that according to disposition of forces, Ivanivske is stormed by the ex-Wagner forces and Special Unit Akhmat. So the most professional Russian forces are storming the former Wagner forces and Special Unit Akhmat. The most professional forces are storming this area right now. So we'll see what is going to be next, but obviously if the Russians enter Ivanivske, we can say that 26th of January is official date of the beginning of the battle for the village. Furthermore, the Russian continue publishing videos of bombings of Ukrainian positions on the 215.7 hill, which is another confirmation that the Russians don't have full control over the village. They control just part of this village, and but the concentration of Russian fire with FPV drones, with artillery, with stealth and tower systems tell us that the Russians probably will try to completely establish control over the stronghold and to force the Ukrainians to step back. They need to do this to secure the southern flank or secure the base of Ivanivske offensive operation, because regarding the fact that the Russians entered the village, currently they have just one way to support their forces along these two lines. There are mines. This supply road is under complete Ukrainian control, fire control, so there is no possibility to use this road. So that's why the Russians need to be 100% sure that Ukrainians can't counterattack and can't force the Russians to step back. And to do this, they need first of all to improve their positions in the vicinity to 115.7 hill and to establish complete and to solve completely the question of Klishchiivka. Now we are moving to Avdiivka direction, where we also got a lot of very interesting details and updates. According to information we have, the Ukrainians lost the battle of the southern part, and now, as I understand, the Ukrainians still send more and more forces to the south, trying to force the Russians to step back. But now, when talking about the first days of counterattacks, those were the days when the Ukrainians tried to restore control over the southern part, over Tsarskaya Khota, over the railways. But when talking about current Ukrainian counteroffensive and attempts to attack, it's just attempt to win some time, to win additional day, to win additional even hour or additional minute, and they need time to prepare the new defense belt in the central part of Avdiivka. They need to stop the Russian breakthrough, they need to create new fortifications, and they need to be sure that the area and the front line is stable on this direction. But of course, we understand that the Russians will not allow them to do this. The Ukrainians published just one geolocated video how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian, let's say, supply road from Tsarskaya Khota to the railways. The Russians start using this area after this territory become Russian, under Russian control, and there is nothing we can see on this map in this video. The only thing is just some movements of Russian forces in the vicinity of the bridge and how the Ukrainians were bombing this territory heavily. That's it. But this is the video show us that now the Russians have a stable supply road from Donetsk to Tsarskaya Khota. They can send endless reserves, reinforcements, supply, munition, tanks, armored vehicles. Now they will try to concentrate their army in this area, infantry, stormtroopers, maybe even some tanks and armored vehicles, and after they concentrate significant number of forces, the Russians will try to move further. And while the Ukrainians counter-attacking, they try to create the new defense belt along these streets with the purpose not to allow the Russians to, let's say, to break through. But this is not the most important part of Avdiivka. The most important updates are coming from the northern direction in the vicinity of Krasnogorovka, from this area. As we discussed, the Ukrainians lost the battle for the southern part of Avdiivka, and but it doesn't mean that Ukrainians lost the battle for Avdiivka itself. And the Ukrainians understand that they have just one thing, just one chance to break the situation and to turn everything back, to stabilize the area and to show some media victory. And of course, To do this, let's say to stop the collapsing of Avdiivka, to stop Avdiivka fall, the Ukrainians can do just one thing. Yes, you're completely correct. The Ukrainians need to counterattack the Russians on the northern direction. They need to counterattack, and not just counterattack. The Ukrainians need to send as many as possible forces, as much as possible forces they can, with the purpose to restore control not just over the railways, but to return control over Krasnogorovka. And according to some Russian sources, currently the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate significant number of forces in this area, and very soon they will launch their offensive operation. During the previous few days, the Ukrainians managed to restore control over some 3 lines in this area, over at least this one that was something like reconnaissance in combat, trying to understand the Russian possibilities, and now the Ukrainians will counterattack. Obviously, this is going to be something like the battle for Robotina. The Ukrainians obviously will use significant number of forces and tanks because they have nothing to lose, because if they lose Avdiivka, very likely they can lose the entire special military operation, because after Avdiivka this is going to be such a big media loss and defeat for the Ukrainians. Very likely the Ukrainian authorities and current Ukrainian power and Zelensky will not be able to hold power and Ukraine in their hands. It will basically collapse. So that's why the Ukrainians understand, while the Russians concentrated all their forces on the south, it's the best time for them to counterattack in Krasnogorovka. And if the Ukrainians, and the main purpose of the Ukrainians is to restore control over the Terikon, Krasnogorovka and positions in this area. If they can do this, then of course the Russians can say goodbye to Avdiivka news operation, because they will be forced to start everything from the beginning. There will be no risks of encirclement of Avdiivka, because the bridgehead and support will be under complete secure and completely stabilized. And furthermore, if the Russians lose Krasnogorovka, they will be forced to step back behind to the right, to the east of N20 road. So this is the only chance the Ukrainians have, and they need to start this offensive operation right now, not like tomorrow or in a month. They need to start this operation today. But the only thing that this operation wasn't prepared. This is going to be something very fast that was written, let's say, on the shoulders of your neighbor when during some meeting in Zelensky office or something like this. But without this operation, there are no chances from Ukrainian side to save Avdiivka in a long-term, let's say, perspective. Furthermore, the Russians intensified their activity on the line Toninkaya-Severnaya. Today, the Sparta forces published significant number of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian forces, which also confirms Russian activity. And the Russians understand, this is not, military summary is not the one who understands that Ukrainians are going to attack Krasnogorovka. Obviously, the Russians also know about this operation, but the Russians want to get 2 things. First, the Russians want to repel the Ukrainians and to defeat them in this area, causing them significant damage and significant losses. And also the Russians are trying and plans to, during the clashes on the south, during the clashes in Krasnogorovka, the Russians also want to attack and conduct unexpected attack in direction of Tonika and Severnaya. So the next 3-4 weeks are going to be the most, let's say, toughest, the most, cruel, the most heaviest for both sides, either for the Russians and for the Ukrainians. The next 3-4 weeks will determine everything. Now we are moving to Marinka. We have some updates from this territory. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians along this tree line, which give us, this video was geolocated. Now we have 100% right to adjust the area and to show this territory under complete Russian control. So we'll do this before the next video. We haven't received anything from Novomikhailivka. We just got another FAB strike against Ukrainian positions in the coal mine, and this is the second strike in a row during January, at least geolocated one and published one. On this video we can see the use of FAB 1500. Just a few days ago in January there was another strike in this area. This is it. Maybe this is the same video, very difficult to understand, but I think that different time of day. This strike took place in the daylight. The previous one that we show at night, and the attack was from different angle. Anyway, we see that the Russians understand that the main communication center, connection center, a lot of equipment are located in this area. Maybe the Ukrainians have some armored vehicles, some warehouses, so that's why they move their focus in this coal mine. And of course, if they can do some damage to this area, it will ease the Russian progress in the vicinity of Novomikhailivka and Ugledar. We haven't received anything from Vremivka tactical bridgehead, nothing strategical. The same story about Rabotina. Now everybody pay focus to Avdiivka, Ivanovska and Kupiansk, and the same story about Krynki. The only thing that we need to pay attention to is that the Russians renew their FAPS attacks. They're bombing this territory heavily. They start bombing this territory heavily with different types of FAP. If you remember, for 2 months the Russians redeployed their aviation from this area, probably due to the problems with air defense from the Ukrainian side. And now we see that the Russians once again feel them safe, pretty comfortable. They bomb everything, and they will continue doing this. The Ukrainians still control some part of Krynki, but the entire Krynki we keep in the gray zone, because nobody knows for sure where exactly the Ukrainians, maybe there are no Ukrainians and there are just the problems for the Russians to establish complete control over the village. And that's it for the video military summary. Channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.